press briefing. And the purpose of it is to penetrate what very sadly is a fog of war, because the reality is that there are clouds of war hanging over Europe at the moment. I am speaking to you from south of Vienna in Austria. So it's very much a concern in Europe. And today we also have to remember this is the 75th anniversary of the Holocaust in Europe. It's the day when Auschwitz was liberated. So it's a solemn moment. I wanted to welcome our guests, who you will be introduced to shortly. I also want to pay thanks, please, to the Swedish Radiation Safety Authority for its support of this briefing. It is a press briefing, as I said, because we want to try to inform a public awareness of some of the issues that are historical, but nonetheless of major significance to the tensions that we are experiencing right now. I also want to thank very briefly my colleague Valeria Hess for her great effort to put this briefing together. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Tarek Rauf, my colleague Tarek Rauf from Atomic Reporters, and he will moderate the session. Tarek, thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter. And I too would like to welcome everyone, including our speakers, and joining us in what we hope will be a very interesting and timely discussion here today on decoding the Budapest Memorandum, the 1994 Accord with Ukraine and current tensions. We have three eminent speakers who have written quite a bit on this and related subjects relating to security with the Russian Federation, Ukraine, and the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty regime. I, as Peter mentioned, am Tarek Rauf. I was formerly head of the IAEA's Security Policy and Verification Office, and also the alternate head of the IAEA's Non-Proliferation Treaty delegation. So our three speakers in order in which they will appear are Dr. Mariana Budjeryn. She's a research associate with the Project on Managing the Atom at the Harvard Kennedy School's Belfer Center. Formerly, she has held appointments as a Stanton Nuclear Fellow at the Managing the Atom Project, and she was also a fellow at the Harvard Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies, and a visiting professor at Tufts University, and also at the Peace Research Institute in Frankfurt. She is the author of Inheriting the Bomb, Soviet Collapse and Nuclear Disarmament of Ukraine, to be published this year by Johns Hopkins University Press. She will then be followed by Dr. Polina Sinovets. She is the director of the Odessa Center for Non-Proliferation and an associate professor in the International Relations Department at Odessa Miechnikov National University in Ukraine. She led a project on the nuclear history of Ukraine from 2004 to 2012 and was a senior research associate at Ukraine's National Institute for Strategic Studies, and also a fellow at the James Martin Center for Non-Proliferation Studies in Monterey. She has also published extensively on nuclear arms control issues. And then we have Dr. Nikolai Sokov. I'm very pleased to mention that he and I have known each other now for more than 25 years. We first met at the Monterey Institute in 1995 when I joined there. So Dr. Nikolai Sokov currently is Senior Fellow at the Vienna Center for Disarmament and Non-Proliferation. He has previously worked with the Soviet and the Russian foreign ministries and participated as a negotiator on the Soviet then Russian delegation for the START I and START II bilateral arms control agreements between the Russian Federation and the United States. He's also worked at the Institute for the US and Canadian Studies and the Institute of World Economy and International Relations of the Soviet Union's Academy of Sciences. He is the author of Soviet Strategic Modernization, Past and Future, among other publications. So I thought before we hand over to Mariana, just to give viewers, since this is a press briefing, a very short overview of what it is that we will be discussing today. So we talk about the Budapest Memorandum, but in actuality, there are 3 identical memoranda which were issued on the 5th of December 1994 to Belarus, Kazakhstan, and Ukraine. However, both Belarus and Kazakhstan had already previously acceded to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty as non-nuclear weapon states. It was only Ukraine which acceded to the Non-Proliferation Treaty on the basis of the Budapest Memorandum, which is why it is given so much significance with regard to Ukraine's accession to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and also with regard to the current status of the Budapest Memorandum and what are regarded to be as violations of the memorandum by the Russian Federation. So these memoranda are actually quite short. There are 6 operational paragraphs. It's also quite interesting, the language that was used. So the memoranda talk about confirming. They don't say that the United Kingdom, the United States, and the Russian Federation, the 3 depository states to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, agree or commit. They just confirm in the following 6 paragraphs that they would provide security assurances. I'm told that in the Ukrainian translation, it is translated as security guarantees. But if we look at some of the writings of the people who were involved, they all say that neither the Russian Federation, nor the United States, nor the United Kingdom were interested in giving legally binding security guarantees as opposed to security assurances. And I'm sure this issue will come up in our discussions. Also, I might mention that the nuclear weapon states have given several security assurances to non-nuclear weapon states, starting with Resolution 255 of 1968, which was a positive security assurance to come to the assistance of a non-nuclear weapon state party to the NPT should it be attacked by a state with nuclear weapons. And this is one of the assurances in the Budapest Memorandum. Then the nuclear weapon states have also given general security assurances to non-nuclear weapon states party to the NPT not to attack them or threaten to attack them with nuclear weapons, as long as the state is not attacking the nuclear weapon state itself in association with another nuclear weapon state. So this again is conditional. And these are similar assurances given to NPT's non-nuclear weapon states that are parties to nuclear weapon-free zone treaties. So the commitments in the Budapest Memorandum are in a sense quite weak, and there are no measures identified that would be taken by the 3 states to Belarus, Kazakhstan, or Ukraine were the Budapest memorandums to be violated or not fully implemented. Finally, also the memorandum doesn't say that it will enter into force. It just says it will become applicable upon signature. Also, the first 2 presidents of Ukraine, Leonid Kravchuk and Leonid Kuchma, apparently were quite inimical to Ukraine, hanging on to the nuclear weapons that were on its territory following the collapse of the Soviet Union. And I vividly remember in early summer of 1995, President Leonid Kuchma visited Ottawa, Canada, and my center, which was funded by the Foreign Ministry, we were asked to do a seminar with him, and he was sitting right next to me, and I asked him a question point blank. Would Ukraine want to keep its nuclear weapons? And he had no hesitation in saying no, that in his view, Ukraine didn't have the technical or the financial capability to maintain the nuclear weapons that were on its territory. Later on in 2014, ex-President Kuchma said that Ukraine had been sold short and had been hoodwinked. This is following the annexation of Crimea. So with that, let me invite Dr. Mariana Budjeryn to give her presentation.
Thank you so much to the Atomic Reporters, to Peter and to Tarek for your kind introductions and for hosting us here. I think there are some slides that we could bring up, if I could ask to be shared. Perfect, thank you so much. I hope everyone can see that. So as Tarek helpfully introduced the topic, we all know why we're here. there's a specter of war in Europe, and Ukraine is somehow right at the center of these tensions. And today we're revisiting Ukraine's nuclear past and the signature of the Budapest Memorandum that was part and parcel of a deal to convince Ukraine to surrender the Soviet nuclear legacy. If I could just have this next slide, please. Thank you. So this is the best map I could find of the Russian forces buildup. Now, this is not, even though this is now the hot issue for the last couple of months, the buildup had actually started, the buildup had actually started already in the middle of 2020 and had continued steadily since there was an issue, sort of hit public awareness last spring. And then in September, there was a large-scale Russian and Belarusian exercise, Zapad 21. So we watched that. And now it doesn't seem like the forces and equipment that have been drawn to the Ukrainian borders for this exercise and for others and for whatever other sort of reasons or pretexts that were given to us, those forces are not being withdrawn. In fact, more forces are being built up. This map is the estimation from November 2021. It says 94,000 troops. Now some of the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense estimations are of upwards of 100. We certainly don't know for sure. We don't have the exact intelligence on that. But there's the troubling part is that there's also tanks and armored vehicles, and those are just basically, firepower and wheels. There's artillery systems, and importantly, missile systems. Some of them, like Iskanders, have a 500-kilometer range. So they could certainly reach well into the Ukrainian territory. If I could have the next slide, please. So what are we to make of this conflict and of this potential, the specter of war in Ukraine? What would be the costs of doing something or doing nothing, and what are the right responses? This is, of course, the million-dollar question nobody knows the answer to, because we are risking, there is another nuclear dimension to this crisis, and that is that NATO is a nuclear-armed alliance. The United States and Russia are two largest nuclear weapon states in the world. Together, they hold upwards of 90% of entire stockpile of nuclear weapons in the world. And nobody really wants to escalate this conflict to the nuclear brink. So this is what makes this conflict or this standoff particularly dangerous and particularly troubling. So from, of course, Ukrainian standpoint, and I have to say, I was just in Ukraine for the holidays. This is where I'm originally from. I was there for Christmas, for Eastern Christmas in early January. And what I was observing was sort of this calm, right? As when you read Western media, it's a big issue, and things seem like there's a brink of war any minute. But in Ukraine, things were calm. And part of the reason, I think, is because Ukraine has been fighting this war for 8 years now. There are young men being drafted and drawn to the front. There have been, there was a very intensive hot period of war in 2014-15, when the bulk of casualties had been sustained, about 14,000 dead, 25,000 wounded. There's millions of internally displaced people. Ukraine has been living this war now for 8 years, and has been, improving its armed forces, has been preparing actually to withstand or to defend itself from further escalation. From the broader standpoint, in terms of international political and security implications. It is a big deal, right? There's a forcible change of state borders in Europe. I know it's unfair. We're a very Eurocentric and Western-centric society. There are probably civil conflicts in Africa and Asia all the time, but somehow it seems to us unfairly so, of course, that Europe should be immune to these kinds of things, especially given the history of this continent. And as Peter mentioned, it is a significant day today, and we know what a large-scale conflict could lead to, and in the middle, in this context, on the European continent. There's a constant risk of escalation, right? So even if you say, okay, Ukraine is not part of core Western interests, Ukraine is not, as important to the West and NATO, to the United States as it is to Russia, let that be. Is Europe prepared to sustain and accept millions of Ukrainian refugees should the war start, should the conflict really go hot and go large scale? So there are exigencies that need to be considered. And of course, what we are going to focus on today is specifically the impact on the international non-proliferation regime via what we call now the Budapest Memorandum. Could I please have the next slide? So as Tarek helpfully outlined, these are the main sort of points, these are the main clauses of the Budapest Memorandum. To rewind a little bit, when Ukraine inherited part of the Soviet nuclear arms complex, nuclear arms, deployed nuclear arms, it was a third largest arsenal in the world. It is true that it was part and parcel of a larger whole. It was an arsenal that was developed by the Soviet Union, a different country, to deter NATO and the West. So for different strategic purposes, as it were. So what Ukraine inherited was not a ready-to-use nuclear deterrent that it could turn on and retarget against Russia, if Russia was the threat to be deterred, and ready to use that way. However, Ukraine, as I mentioned, was part and parcel of a Soviet, nuclear and military industrial complex. It had the scientific, the technological, the industrial capacity to build up the missing links and to refashion. Eventually, it would have taken money and it would have taken time and it would have taken the political will. But it was a really generous, and I say it, I sometimes sound like a broken record, but it's an apt way of thinking about it. It was a general proliferator starting package. There were nuclear warheads that were in the custody of Ukrainian military forces eventually. There was a powerful missile building industry. There was an aviation building industry. There was a guidance systems industry or industrial capacity. There were two competent nuclear research institutes. So yes, the Ukraine would have had to exert investments to invest time and money into building up a usable nuclear deterrent. But it had very, very important pieces already in place. With that, however, Ukraine started its path towards independent statehood with the declaration that it wanted to be a non-nuclear state, that it wanted to relinquish this nuclear legacy. First and foremost, well, for two reasons, really. One was Chernobyl. Two was because at that time, it thought it would be impossible to achieve a fully fledged political independence when it was kind of looped, when it was tied through these military and command links to the center, to Moscow. So that was a way for Ukraine to actually achieve its full political independence. It's to cut itself off from this common military strategic space. The events kind of overtook that. So the Soviet Union fell apart precipitously, and Ukraine did find itself already independent with these weapons still on its territory. And then the nuclear debates really started in earnest. And the hopes that the two major to biggest successor states of the Soviet Union, the Russian Federation, Ukraine, could find kind of an amicable way forward and refashion their relationship maybe on equal footing, as President Yeltsin had declared that Russia would be an equal amongst equals. Those soon became mired in tensions, and most of these tensions really were over Crimea and over the division of the Black Sea Fleet and over the supply of energy supplies to Ukraine, in which Ukraine was entirely dependent on Russia. So as we can see, those issues are really not new. They have been kind of part and parcel of this post-Soviet fallout, of the post-Soviet security settlement. And as early as spring 1992, the Ukrainian parliament has stipulated and demanded that yes, Ukraine will stand by its commitments and it will move towards complete nuclear disarmament, but it demanded security guarantees as part of the deal. So in exchange for giving up nuclear weapons, the other part would have been the compensation for the value of these nuclear weapons, specifically the fissile material, the highly enriched uranium and plutonium that was contained in the warheads. So these negotiations were set in motion already very early on in the spring of 1992. And with the security guarantees, which is what Ukraine sought, Ukraine first and foremost approached the United States. So the negotiations started in July 1992, and it is telling that it was the United States that Ukraine approached for these security guarantees, for these security commitments. So even though they were the signatories of the present memorandums are the three depository states of the NPT, of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, the United States, the United Kingdom, and Russia. It was really implicitly understood that it was Western guarantees that Ukraine was seeking against a potential Russian threat. Ukraine, of course, wanted something robust, something legally binding, and something that would stipulate consequences for its breach. And by the middle of 1993, by about June of 1993, the Ukrainian Ministry of Foreign Affairs actually drafted a treaty. There was a draft treaty, you can find it in the Ukrainian archives, on security guarantees to Ukraine. However, at that point, nobody in the West was ready to pledge these kind of binding security commitments to a new country that was unstable, that, nobody was sure how this post-Soviet kind of settlement would look like. As a general rule of thumb, the United States normally does not like to take additional international obligations if it could help it, and it could. It was a powerful country, it had all sorts of leverage and had other means of achieving Ukraine's disarmament as an outcome without kind of binding itself with a bunch of additional security related obligation. So in the end, with Ukraine having little leverage and being under considerable pressure to accede to the NPT, and part of that story was, of course, the coming into force of START 1 and the further negotiations and coming into force of START 2 treaties. And I'm sure Nikolai Sokov will touch upon these things in much more detail. But in the end, it was agreed that there would be a separate memorandum. It's a political document, memorandum of understanding between the three NPT depository states and Ukraine. So the memorandum was negotiated really by the Ukrainian diplomats and the United States and Russia. And it was just copy pasted and then sort of made part of extended also to Belarus and to Kazakhstan as they kind of came as a single case of post-Soviet proliferation and a single case of sort of under the similar circumstances acceding to the NPT after the post-Soviet disarmament. But it was really an achievement of Ukrainian diplomacy. And as Tarek helpfully outlined, what the provisions of the memorandum essentially reiterated existing commitments and obligations under other multilateral agreements and treaties and documents, let's say. So the UN Charter, these were literally verbatim copy pasted into the memorandum. Commitment to refrain from the use and threat of force from the UN Charter, respect for Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity from the OSCE's Helsinki Final Act, commitment to refrain from economic coercion, something Ukraine insisted should be included in view of Russian leverage in terms of energy supplies to Ukraine, that again, Russia did not, was not so shy in using at the time, nor is it now. And the so-called negative and positive NPT-related nuclear security assurances that are extended to all non-nuclear weapon states under the NPT by the recognized nuclear weapon states within the NPT. The only addition, something new that was manifested in the memorandum, is an agreement to convene consultations between the parties should the issues in connection with the memorandum arise. And for the first time, this clause was activated, this mechanism, in March 2014. The signatories did convene a meeting in Paris on March 5th, I think. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, who was in Paris at the time, and Paris was where this meeting took place, decided not to attend. He simply didn't show up, providing a rationale that this agreement or memorandum was signed with a different Ukrainian government and not this one, which under international law, of course, is not a very valid justification. Next slide, please. So to summarize, nope, the previous one. Yeah, thank you. To summarize, this is what the memorandum is not. It is not a binding security guarantee, something like Article 5 of the Washington Treaty within the NATO alliance. This is something Ukraine would have probably liked to have at the time, at least a guaranteed neutrality, as it were, not alliance, but some kind of pledge of some kind of consequence for breaching this agreement. And it was not signed in a sort of legally binding format, although there's some claims to say, oh, since it's since it is a reiteration of UN Charter, is a UN Charter legally binding? Yeah, probably it is. And then, by extension, this memorandum is, and it is part and parcel of the broader, of the NPT-related regime. It did not specify consequences for its breach. And ultimately, long-term, and it has been something I have argued, of course, the counterfactuals are difficult in our profession, but this was probably a window of opportunity. This was probably a chance. If some kind of guaranteed neutrality was to be achieved in Ukraine, that the Budapest Memorandum was probably it. For a variety of reasons, it was not considered and given serious thought at the time. Yet it's not, as even some in Ukraine unhelpfully maintain, a worthless piece of paper. It is an important international document in these following ways. By signing this memorandum, and this was said by the negotiators of it on the US side, excuse me, Ukraine's security concerns, Ukraine's security predicament was now grounded in the sphere of US interests. This is what Ukrainians were told. We cannot give you legally binding guarantees, but this is what it means. A president is signing this document. And this means that Ukraine will be in the sphere of US interest from now on, that Ukraine will not be let to stand alone if it is threatened. Another importance of it was to provide a foundation in the sense of framework for building up this kind of security cooperation with the United States and with the West. Now, that particular part was not taken advantage of in the times of peace, right? We as societies and political systems consistently fail to make hay when sun shines, right? We only start thinking about it when it's too late and the crisis comes in. So in the times of peace, this could have been a very nice and helpful framework to start building up this kind of security and military cooperation. And importantly, for us as nuclear scholars, the Budapest Memorandum is now part and parcel of the broader international non-proliferation regime, and its breach does affect the credibility of the regime in general. I mean, the regime and the NPT is an inherently discriminatory treaty. It treats like actors, sovereign states, differently. Some are allowed to keep nuclear weapons and others pledge to not recourse to these weapons for the sake of their security. So they give up some kind of part of their sovereign rights to consider these weapons as legitimate weapons of defense. There have been consistent tensions between nuclear haves and nuclear have-nots, but there's sort of has been this truce, this set of compromises or bargains, as they're called, and the general understanding that the fewer nuclear states in the world, the better for everyone, right? That's the basis of the nuclear non-proliferation norm. And of course, these are very tenuous bargains, and they are very difficult to argue and sustain. When a nuclear weapon state threatens a non-nuclear weapon state in such a way that, given the history, that non-nuclear weapon state had already anticipated this threat when it was giving up nuclear weapons or a potential to develop its own nuclear deterrent some 20 years or 25 years prior. And with that, I will end my presentation and hand it off to Polina. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mariana. That was a very rich and detailed presentation. You made a comment that the Budapest Memorandum had been signed by presidents, and therefore it gives it much more weight. So if we compare it with the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action that was signed by foreign ministers and then underpinned by a Security Council resolution, in this case 2231, but then again, one government decided to walk away from it. So my point is not to label any one government, but my point was to reinforce the point that you made about the discriminatory nature of the NPT regime, where the weapon states give assurances or commitments to non-nuclear weapon states, but when it suits them, they walk away from them. So I was wondering whether you might want to say something general on this particular point briefly.
Yeah, thank you, Tarek. That's a great question. And as we were anticipating the NPT RevCon just this month, it got postponed, but nobody who's in the field, expected a good and productive review conference. And that is simply because these tensions run very deep within the regime right now. And, nuclear weapon states do have a very privileged position within the regime, and there should be an attending level of responsibility. Again, nobody in the field that I know of supported the US pullout, the Trump administration pullout from JCPOA, and the Trump administration was particular, let's put it that way, in more ways than one. However, Iran probably does not feel the same level of existential threat at the hands of the United States as Ukraine probably feels now, and especially given this history. This is not to justify the JCPOA pullout, but simply, as you say, to underscore that there is a particular onus and a burden of responsibility on the states that claim to be kind of the guardians of the broader security, international security structures.
Yeah, that's a good point, Mariana. In this case, Ukraine shares a border with a nuclear weapon state, which Iran does not. So we're moving on now to Polina Sinovets. We're happy to hear you now, Polina.
Yes, hello, and my presentation, may I share it or someone will provide it? Okay, I see, thank you very much. Yes, my presentation will be probably shorter than Mariana's because Mariana has touched upon many issues I wanted to do. Anyway, the idea of how the breach of the Budapest Memorandum affected Ukraine and the NPT regime is in the focus of my presentation. So next slide, please. I suggest to look at the number of issues. Of course, the Budapest Memorandum meaning for Ukraine. Again, the consequences of the Budapest Memorandum for collapse for Ukraine, and the consequences and the conclusions which Ukraine has drawn from the collapse of Budapest Memorandum. And finally, the Budapest Memorandum and its meaning for the NPT, and again, the meaning of its would you please give the next slide? Okay. As Mariana previously said, of course, Budapest Memorandum was repeating, some important international treaties. There was nothing especially new there. But as you know, it's usually the beauty is in the eyes of the beholder. So for Ukraine, Budapest Memorandum played very supposed to play, I believe. First of all, because for some reason, Ukrainian authorities trusted Budapest Memorandum as some universal, pact or treaty on the security guarantees, not as security assurances, given in the framework of the common treaties. And it led to actual fetishizing of diplomacy in regard to ensuring national security and defense. First of all, because we even didn't have the notion of deterrence in our military doctrines before 2014, when the threat to our national security became obvious. Even in the military doctrine 2012, the idea of if the conflict erupts, it was said that the main conflict prevention and conflict regulation was referring of Ukraine to its Budapest Memorandum guarantors. And then there was a high belief that everything will be somehow settled down. Of course, it led to the situation that Ukrainian army was not developed. Ukrainian army was in decline. Ukrainian political structures were not producing anything useful on defense and security, because nobody was actually thinking about security in strategic terms. Maybe it was so-called inertia of the founding fathers of the Budapest Memorandum, because if to refer to words of the first president, Leonid Kravchuk, who actually, was the first founding father of not Budapest Memorandum, but the nuclear disarmament, he said in one of his interviews that it had never happened, and it will never happen, that Russians and Ukrainians will use weapons against each other or wage any kind of war. It's just impossible. And it had never been, it will never happen. And maybe it was the result of that kind of trust. And also the fact that Budapest Memorandum had that in Ukrainian translation, and I think it in Russian as well, the word guarantee instead of assurances also played a role, because everyone trusted in that kind of guarantees. And nobody was thinking about assurances before 2014, when the situation with the annexation of Crimea and with the Donbass started. And then the American partners started explaining us the real meaning of the Budapest Memorandum. Next slide, please. What happened with Ukraine after 2014? Because the topic of Budapest Memorandum is constantly exploited everywhere since now. First of all, in 2014, the immediate reactions of the first two presidents of Ukraine, Leonid Kravchuk and Leonid Kuchma, was that Ukraine should accept the bill on the withdrawal from the NPT, because in Ukrainian law on the accession to the NPT, there is the paragraph that Ukraine can use the Article 10 of NPT and to withdraw from the treaty in case if the higher security concerns will demand that. Simultaneously, the other bill on the restoration of the nuclear status of Ukraine was registered in Verkhovna Rada. Of course, none of that bill passed any kind of voting. They were just, registered and nothing followed, because Ukraine was never going to come back to nuclear path. However, the narrative connected with the Budapest Memorandum became one of the core narratives of all Ukrainian presidents and other officials. For example, President Poroshenko was always speaking about the failure of Budapest Memorandum as the showcase case of the malfunction of the NPT regime. And in 2017, he even given a speech at the United States, he even suggested the United States to restore its guarantees or its assurances according to the Budapest Memorandum and to save the NPT regime. And again, at the same time, Ukrainian parliament suggested the United States to provide Ukraine security guarantees in the framework of the bilateral alliance between the United States and Ukraine. Again, President Zelensky has also never been silent about Budapest Memorandum. And, let me remind you that the opinion poll, which he conducted on the Budapest Memorandum in 2020, about the necessity to use guarantee security assurances provided Budapest Memorandum, it was not really clear what he was meaning, but the clear was the understanding the great dissatisfaction of Zelensky with the current situation connected with assurances and the Budapest Memorandum. Again, in 2021, Zelensky in his interview said that nuclear disarmament was a big mistake because nuclear weapons could prevent Russia from attacking Ukraine. And as it turned out, the 79.35% of Ukrainians supported this idea in 2020. Again, the opinion polls show that in 2020, 62.5% of Ukrainians support the idea that Ukraine should renew its nuclear status. And the number of this support in 2014 was just 49%. So as you see that the support to the idea of nuclear weapons is growing in Ukraine. Also, what I want to say about probably the current worldview of Ukrainians toward Budapest Memorandum, and probably it also will affect the worldview, the general worldview about Budapest Memorandum, is that, for example,
So what happened to Polina? A cyber attack? Maybe we go to Nikolai, and then when Polina is back, we can come back to her.
Polina is back, I think.
Polina is back?
Yes, I'm back. But
Okay.
I can't turn on.
Go ahead.
Can you please turn on the sound?
We can hear you, Polina. Oops.
Your sound is still off, Polina. Maybe you can do it from your machine.
Okay, do you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, yeah, coming back to the interpretation of Budapest Memorandum by Ukrainians, for example, as for the diplomatic initiatives, let me say that Ukraine just ignored the TPNW emergence in the world stage. We just didn't vote, you know, showing just full total ignorance for the TPNW, because actually it suggested because maybe the failure of Budapest Memorandum and the dissatisfaction and the disappointment in the situation made Ukrainian population not to believe in any kind of assurances, believing that the main assurance is nuclear weapons. That is why, of course, Ukraine is not ready to come back to nuclear path. And I don't think that any of Ukrainian citizens have any kind of you know, beliefs in it. But the you know, sort of miss for nuclear weapons, which would save us from the Russian invasion, is always in the air. So please, could you please give us the next slide? No, yeah, this one. Okay, speaking a little bit about the role of the Budapest Memorandum for the NPT regime. First of all, it was while mentioning that the indefinite extension of the NPT would never happen without Ukraine signing the Budapest Memorandum and joining the NPT as non-nuclear state. And though the Budapest Memorandum has never been among the core pillars of the NPT regime, it had become the quite important, I would say, supporting mechanism, or quite important booster for the non-proliferation regime. You know, showing that positive examples, so showing how the regime works, and you know, had become one of the additional pillars of the regime. And in spite of the fact that, of course, you know, Russia has never used any nuclear weapons against Ukraine yet, and in this regard, none of the assurances were breached. Of course, the main you know, the main paragraphs, one of the main paragraphs which Ukraine was hoping to preserve by signing Budapest Memorandum was just the preservation of Ukrainian borders, Ukrainian territorial integrity, and the Ukrainian sovereignty over the borders. But it was breached, and now we are facing the aggravating situation when actually the biggest nuclear state in the world is blackmailing the world with the threat of invading Ukraine, who has signed Budapest Memorandum and having signed the assurances to Ukraine in the past. What is, I think, this sort of an irony, because Russia today is sitting for sort of the guarantees by giving that guarantees, sort of the guarantees to Ukraine in 1994. So, however, I think that all of this situation, you know, no matter of how it looks from outside, it you know, creates quite important impact over the NPT regime. Could you please give us the next slide? Okay. Again, yes, I agree with Mariana. It's about the gradual loss of the credibility of the NPT regime. Because, of course, the failure of Budapest Memorandum was not the main impact over the regime. sustainability, but it's like the crack on the windshield. If you are not fixing it, it will, bring you substantial problems in the future. Again, I would say that the failure of Budapest Memorandum demonstrates the obvious loss of the liberal paradigm, because the NPT is a part of the liberal paradigm, and now we see the probably the rising of the realistic paradigm, which is everything about the weapons and the hard power, which is the main tool of security, which is the main tool of provision the national security. And of course, I believe that in the future, it will be really hard to persuade such states as DPRK or Iran or whoever else thinking about acquiring nuclear weapons to give them up in exchange for the security assurances, because no one trusts security assurances after the Budapest Memorandum failure. And I think it will aggravate the problems connected with the NPT sustainability in the future. Yes, I think that I'm done. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Polina, for also an excellent presentation. I was very closely involved with NPT's extension in '95. So I might quibble with you about your assertion about the point that you made about indefinite extension not happening without Ukraine, but that's for another discussion. But for now, I'd like to draw your attention to, on the 19th of December, 1994, a letter was sent to the General Assembly signed by Sergei Lavrov and Madeleine Albright, and also by the Ukrainian ambassador to the UN, Anatoly Zelenko, and his British counterpart, David Haney, in which they forwarded not only the Budapest Memorandum to the General Assembly for circulation to all UN member states, but they also added a joint declaration of the 5th of December by the leaders of Russia, Ukraine, the UK, and the United States. And I'll read you two elements of this joint declaration, and I was wondering whether you might comment on that and why in the discussion on the Budapest Memorandum reference isn't also made to this joint declaration by the leaders of the three NPT depository states and also Ukraine. So in one of the paragraphs, they say the leaders discussed the evolution of European security architecture. They underscored their determination to support the increasingly strong tendencies towards the formation of security based on political partnership and to cooperate in the further development of a security system that embraces all the CSCE states. And then it also says the leaders confirmed that CSCE commitments in the area of human rights, economics, and security represent the cornerstone of the common European security space, and that they help ensure that countries and peoples in this space are not subjected further to the threat of military force or other undesirable consequences of aggressive nationalism and chauvinism. So how would you interpret this, and why in the discussions on the Budapest Memorandum reference is also not made to this joint declaration, which is at the level of the leaders, heads of state?
Thank you very much, Tariq, for this question. I think that, the joint declaration was reiterating the spirit of Budapest Memorandum in the way of underlying that the new era of relations started. And I think that in the beginning of 1990, there was a strong hope that, the new era has started, and that honeymoon in the US-Russian relations, which I think ended up with the Ukrainian nuclear disarmament ended up, it gave the hope that everything has changed since the Cold War, and that, Budapest Memorandum is the workable mechanism. But at the same time, as we see, times changing, and that is why now we are where we are now. So I think that it was a very bright reflection of that time, which had ended up maybe in the beginning of that century, when Russia understood that for some reason it's not satisfied with the present situation with the status quo and decided to develop the situation differently. Well, okay, we can, there are multiple reasons why it happened, but anyway, I think that you would agree that the situation, the whole spirit of international relations has significantly changed since 1990s, when there were a lot of hopes that everything will go differently. And unfortunately, it hasn't, or it happened for a very short period of time.
Yeah, one could also say it's much broader than Russia and Ukraine. It's also the US and the Russian Federation and so on. So now we move on to Dr. Nikolai Sokov, and I hope he's going to, Sokov rather, I'm sorry, Nikolai Sokov, who's going to give us a Russian view, and also maybe if you want to comment towards the end of your remarks, Nikolai, on what Mariana and Polina said, and then we can have a discussion between the three of you, and then open it up to questions from the audience through the chat function. Nikolai?
Thank you, Tariq. I'll try to be short, and I don't have extra slides because, well, I think it's pretty simple and clear. So my presentation will consist of two parts, and one is general assessment. That's my own view, and the second part is how I understand the Russian position there. And please keep in mind that I'm not authorized to present the Russian position. I don't work for the Russian government, and I'm not even in Moscow. So, yeah. So anyway, I don't think that there was an exchange of nuclear weapons for security guarantees. I actually very much disagree with Mariana that Ukraine could actually become a nuclear weapon state. There wasn't the technical capability, yes, and there wasn't the financial capability to very quickly become a nuclear weapon state. Basically, Ukraine had to do that in 3 years. Yes, and that was simply not actually doable, especially given the economic and financial situation at that time. So yes, Ukraine did control nuclear weapons. It could not use nuclear weapons, and moreover, yes, it could not maintain, refurbish, much less produce nuclear weapons. Plus, you need to keep in mind that that buildings and nuclear weapons complex would have happened not only very, very quickly, unrealistically quickly, but also, well, you know, was in front of public eye. Worth recalling that countries like India, Pakistan, North Korea pursued their nuclear programs actually in secret. No one knew about that, yes, and that was actually one of the reasons for success. Here, everyone would have actually followed developments in Ukraine. Yes, link to the NPT was important. Yes, I agree with what has been said about the link to the NPT. Worth recalling, there was also a link to START 1. Because actually, the immediate kind of, well, one of the immediate reasons for adopting the Budapest Memorandum was the fact that Rada had to ratify START 1 the second time. And the failure to do that would have actually meant collapse of all the arms control measures negotiated in the last years of the Cold War. So that was another actually stimulus, very strong actually reason for the United States to go ahead and offer that option. Yes, quite honestly, I still believe that to a large extent, the Budapest Memorandum was intended mostly for actually Rada. Not so much for the government, because Leonid Kuchma, the former director of what then was still known as Yuzhmash, I think it was renamed a little bit later, well, not really renamed, but translated into Ukrainian a little bit later, he understood the challenges very, very well. So we should simply not forget about start one. Now, the memorandum it's already been said. I also agree is really a compendium is of relevant provisions from a variety of other documents, from the Charter, Helsinki Final Act, the Paris Charter for Europe. So quite frankly, if we talk about violation of the Budapest Memorandum, I always prefer to talk about violation of the original documents, yes, and not the derivative. So I understand the psychological and political kind of reasons why Ukraine talks about Budapest, but from my kind of perspective, well, it's more important to talk about the fundamental documents that figured there. And finally, I think Polina actually discussed that, and I want to support it. Well, maybe again slightly different kind of words. I think she's completely right. We failed to build with an inclusive system of security in Europe and actually in the world. 94 was a whole different time. We thought very differently about the world, about how the world's going to look like. Everyone really, I don't want to assign like any blames. So everyone contributed one way or the other. Failed to build such a system, and really, especially starting after like late 90s, roughly, the world began to slide toward a more chaotic structure. Yes, and in such a structure, power, not just military power, but including military power, plays a key role. Is at the expense of diplomacy, is of international law, international regimes. So what we see with the Budapest Memorandum is just one specific case of a very, very broad phenomenon, and I don't really know how we get out of that situation. Is I hope that we do get out of it alive, and that would be a really big achievement. So yes, that's the general, overview, some remarks, not necessarily very comprehensive, but some key points that I wanted to make. And if we now go to the Russian position, I can actually limit myself to just one sentence, that Russia does not talk about the Budapest Memorandum. That's quite understandable. Not surprising, but an in-depth look at the Russian discourse suggests what it might actually say if it were forced to voice its position. And not surprisingly, that would be put in a much broader context, actually, of deteriorating security environment in Europe, yes, and the world in general. Yes, and Russia would actually say that it has never violated the Budapest Memorandum. With respect to Donbass, it would say that that it recognizes Donbass as part of Ukraine, so there is no violation of territory. There were domestic developments in Ukraine that Russia classifies as civil war, and it simply supports some good guys who are not really happy with what's been going on in Kyiv. But as soon as we implement Minsk II, Ukraine will get Donbass back. I personally have a very dissenting, actually, view of Minsk II that's very different from everyone else, to be honest. Well, maybe not everyone, but a lot of people. I think that Putin realized very quickly that he had made a mistake. Everything I know about what was happening well, not in Donbass, I don't know what's happening in Donbass, but what was happening in Moscow suggests that was a major miscalculation. Because Russia found itself in a situation where it could not really I got distracted. So it had to extract itself, but with a face-saving kind of solution. Yes, and Minsk 2 was intended as that, and I always tend to draw a parallel between Donbass and Tatarstan. One can recall that back in '92, Tatarstan was on the verge of actually leaving Russia and creating an independent state. Yeltsin granted its full autonomy. I'll take as much autonomy as you can, he said. Everyone was against that, but yes, it somehow kind of went through. But eventually, by the late 90s, Tatarstan was already once again fully reintegrated into Russia. And I think that was kind of the general concept behind Minsk 2 as far as Russia is concerned. That option was not domestically acceptable in Ukraine. Yes, in 2015, yes, and later, still not fully acceptable. So yes, that's really kind of the challenge. I think Minsk 2 itself has always been kind of accepted by both Russia and by Ukraine, except that they always disagreed on the sequence. So whether Minsk 2 should be implemented all in the same sequence that is written, or it should be different, and Ukraine first gets control of territories and then does political elements. So yes, that was kind of the thing, but anyway, Russia has never so far challenged that Donbass is part of Ukraine. Okay. With Crimea in the place of Russian diplomats, I would actually point at Kosovo. We tend to forget that the whole Crimea story consisted of two stages. It first announced itself independent, and then had the second referendum to join Russia as an independent state. So the first stage was actually implemented in full accordance with the US view on how constituent parts of existing states should go independent. Yes, and that's the US legal views on independence of Kosovo, 2009, that's Obama. Full compliance. Okay, the Western view has always been that Kosovo is an exception, it's not a precedent, but precedent is in the eye of the beholder, so Russia effectively implemented that US document. It's really, really interesting that, look, at first we planned to do the whole thing, like in one step, to vote on switching from Ukraine to Russia. Yes, and then literally like 2 weeks before the referendum, they changed it to the two-step procedure. Why Russia does not cite the president of Kosovo openly is also understandable, because it would actually need to accept independence of Kosovo and recognize it as an independent state, but it does have that special relationship to Serbia and so on and so forth. Yes, by the way, I would not actually rule out the recognition of Kosovo as an exchange of recognition of Crimea as part of Russia by the West, but the West will never do the latter, so Russia will never do the former. So that's kind of this whole conflict. So yes, that's basically how Russia would probably structure its position on the Budapest Memorandum. So there's never been like a violation. When it comes to nuclear weapons, they've not been invoked. I would actually go one step further and say that even with Ukraine having nuclear weapons, so the nuclear status of Ukraine would not have prevented what has happened. Nuclear weapons are for extremely serious contingencies for the matter of survival, and in the specific conditions, if you look at Crimea, how it all happened, if you look at Donbass, how it all happened, there wasn't a specific instance for Ukraine to use nuclear weapons. When two countries, both of them, have nuclear weapons, they can still have conflict. Look at the lower level. Well, of course, well, it's hard to guarantee that, but I'm pretty kind of convinced that nuclear status of Ukraine would not have changed or anything, or at least not much. So, yeah, I don't think that nuclear status of Ukraine well, is something that needs to be on the agenda, that it could actually change things significantly. Now, to conclude, now we got the major kind of crisis. By the way, I don't actually think that Russia plans to invade Ukraine. It simply doesn't make sense whatsoever. Well, at least with a large scale of invasion. Well, it might take place, but that would be a whole specific, actually, line of developments that I hope we avoid. Yes, and that specific line of developments includes massive sanctions against Russia. So the calls that you can hear nowadays quite often that all those huge sanctions, top of the line, should be introduced against Russia preemptively is actually a very bad idea, because if Russia does not have anything to lose, okay, yeah, then it can invade anyone, and yes, it got nothing really to lose. So yeah, no limits, period. But that's really kind of the only contingency out there. Current crisis is more about the European security architecture at large, but including the situation around Donbass, and I think that about 1/4, yes, of the current crisis, I actually believe that it was engineered by Russia quite most intentionally. So about 1/4 of that is really the desire to finally get an agreement on Donbass, yes, and to leave. So we've already seen the Normandy format revived. We see that Russia actually managed to force US and Europe to reassess the chances, yes, and to get more active on that. Well, actually, the Russian and Ukrainian problems are very similar in a way. The two countries face very similar problems. They have no voice. No voice in NATO, no voice in the European Union. Two countries that remained, on the outside. That's actually one of the reasons why there's always conflicts, why there are so few instruments to seriously kind of, discuss issues in a more civilized fashion. Yes, and that's why I say that we, as Europe, as the world, failed to create an inclusive security system. So yes, that's kind of the big thing. So now Russia is forcing actually the US and NATO toward the dialogue by creating a crisis. Can Ukraine do that? Will it do that? I don't know. Final remark is actually about the NPT. Yes, that's more like the response to the earlier kind of questions. I would say that the foundations of the NPT were shaken much earlier than 2014. We talk about the fact that the George W. Bush administration led to collapse of the agreed framework on North Korea. We talk about the war in Iraq 2003, which was justified by non-proliferation. We talk about the US-India deal in 2005. We talk about Libya, in 2011. So yes, I would say that yes, the Budapest Memorandum is just one brick in that crumbling wall. Yeah. Okay, I think I'm done. Yes, I really tried to be to do it very quickly. Do I answer questions now?
Yes. So first, I'll put up a question to you. Then we'll have an opportunity for the three of you if you want to discuss something. And I have several questions that I have taken note of that people have put in the chat question that I will put up to you. So Nikolai, Mariana mentioned, and it's also, of course, well known that one of the Russian positions with regard to the Budapest Memorandum is that the government to which they gave the assurance in 1994, that government no longer exists. And therefore, the Russian assurance given in that document is no longer valid, and therefore, in the Russian view, there's no violation. So what is, as you were a negotiator of an arms control treaty, so what is your personal view about this distinction between a commitment given to a government as opposed to a commitment given state to state?
Yes, Russia makes a claim that since the legitimate government, a legitimate president had to flee the country, and unelected people assumed power. Ukraine did not have a legitimate government until the election of Poroshenko as president. Well, you can make that argument. I don't really think it's very convincing. I don't really think it's very convincing.
Okay.
But you can make that argument, yeah.
Mariana, Polina, do you have any?
Well, it really brings to mind all the events after the 1917 Bolshevik Revolution, in Russia and so on and so forth.
Okay, Mariana and Polina, do you have any comments or questions for Nikolai? Or?
Yeah, if I could just make a couple of brief remarks. I very much agree with Polina, and I think it worked out very nicely that she focused on the contemporary sort of fallout internally, politically, of the breach of the Budapest Memorandum and all these perceptions that I personally don't think are particularly helpful to kind of dismiss that document by the Ukrainians themselves when they could mobilize it in more constructive ways in diplomacy, right, in international fora. But just to clarify on guarantees versus assurances, Tarek, as you mentioned too, there is this issue, and the issue is also in translation. So in the Ukrainian translation and in the Russian translation, which, the Russian translation is also very important because it is, an NPT depository state that has certain privileges in interpreting, kind of guarding the very meaning of the treaty, of the NPT. The word is guarantees. In English, it is assurances. Ukrainian diplomats knew very well that difference, and knew very well the nuance and the difference between assurances and guarantees. And they maintained that actually there isn't a particularly good word for assurances in Ukrainian, which is somewhat true, but not entirely true. The word zapevnення is awkward, and it's not really used very much in diplomatic language. But moreover, they needed to sell that document internally to a very disgruntled, to a very divided parliament, to a divided public, who were suspecting they were not getting what they should have at the moment. So it was kind of a two-level game, and the Ukrainian, diplomats kind of played it that way. But instead, again, as Polina said, there was kind of this fetishizing. Well, now we got the document signed, we're good. Instead of using it as a basis for further diplomatic work for further real kind of building up of these relationships. They sort of rested on laurels. And of course, there was a change of political power. And there's a question in the chat actually about kind of the psychological aspects and what the Ukrainians think now about sort of shooting at Russians. And it was certainly very true of the immediate post-Soviet time, but also, up until 2014, there were very important and I think very helpful psychological barriers of entering into conflict with a country and a people that, not like Mr. Putin likes to think are the same people, but that have, they share the neighborhood. They are culturally close. There are many intermarriages. The military, especially the Soviet generation, they went to the same school, military colleges. They served side by side. So this was one of the kind of less appreciated nefarious aspects of this war, is that psychological barrier has been broken. And that's very unfortunate. So going forward, Ukrainians will defend their country. The morale is extremely high right now. To Nikolai, I think there's a false dichotomy of thinking about this Ukrainian sort of inheritance of whether Ukrainians had nuclear weapons, they had a ready-made deterrent that could be turned on and used right away, or there weren't even Ukrainian weapons to give up. Like the Ukrainians were, ignorant about the whole thing, had nothing to do with these weapons, and they were just like bargaining and blackmailing to get something out of nothing. There's a whole bunch of kind of space in between. So certainly within, I would even say not just 3 years, but within 3 to 5 years, Ukrainians could have had some kind of deterrent had they chosen to do so, and had they somehow squeezed out, the money out of the economy. There's a nice, an interesting 1996 article in Ядерный контроль, which is a Russian kind of non-proliferation journal, by a team of nuclear scientists from Vienna Automatiki, which is one of Russia's nuclear labs. It's an equivalent of Sandia, basically, that assessed all post-Soviet states and their nuclear capacity. And the Russian scientists thought that within about 3 to 5 years, given the resources, Ukrainians could have built up that kind of deterrent capacity should they have chosen. So the issue was always the cost, right? Not only economic cost, but also international political cost of doing so. Thank you.
So I'll read out some questions. So we have a couple of questions from Lars van Dassen, who's currently the director of the World Institute for Nuclear Security. So one of that you already referred to, Mariana, is the psychological barrier. And you also mentioned to the intermarriages, and there are many military officers, both in Ukraine and Russia, who are married to either a Ukrainian or a Russian. And as you mentioned, many of these officers or soldiers were brothers in arms. And now they may be staring at each other across a gun barrel. And how would that affect morale and then further relations into society? But Lars also had another question in which he says that in 2014, President Putin was quoted by somebody or the other that perhaps 70 to 200 nuclear weapons could be used in this theater. How credible is this? So there's also a question from Yuri Krivinos, who, of course, as you can see from the name, is Ukrainian. He's former director of the UN Regional Center for Peace and Disarmament in the Asia Pacific and served in the Soviet Armed Forces. He wonders whether the relationship between Russia and Ukraine might be better with no nuclear weapons involved. In other words, Russia didn't have nuclear weapons, if I understand his question. A question from Wilmarsh, Germany, from former IAEA colleague. This is directed to Nikolai. Why, in your view, Russia did not insist on written assurances or guarantees or written commitments on no NATO expansion, no intention, no plan, and no whatever were the 3 no's that were given. Another question relates to what if sanctions were to be announced now, what might be the effect on the situation? And I'll also put one more question there. Were there to be a military action now, what in your view would be the effect on the NPT, on non-nuclear weapon states in the region? So we'll start with Polina, go to Marina, then Nikolai, you can take your pick which of those you would like to address.
Well, there were a lot of questions and none of them was directed to me. That is why it's really hard to pick up from the pool. I don't know. Can you please give me one?
Well, maybe you want to talk more about the psychological aspect, even though Mariana mentioned of 2 people who are so close, and now you are facing an armed conflict, and armed conflict has been taking place since 2014.
Well, you know what? It's really it still sounds as unbelievable, because besides we have a lot of intermarriages and other things. Most part of Ukraine still speaks Russian, including that part where I live, right? So we are even the same language speaking nations. When when Ukrainian nuclear disarmament was still discussed, it was, I mean, back in 1990s, there were 2 very popular articles by John Mearsheimer and Stephen Miller, the case for Ukrainian nuclear disarmament, the case against Ukrainian nuclear disarmament. And the article by Mearsheimer was obviously more popular in Ukrainian Verkhovna Rada. That is why maybe they were so much rejecting to the disarmament. But for the other people who read it, I would say that for the most of the common people who read it that time, and even in the beginning of 2000s, it was obviously absolutely impossible that Russia could attack Ukraine. It was something that we just came from the same country, and then it was something very much which could not combine with the normal thinking of a Ukrainian citizen. And there is always, has become a popular idea that Putin gave Ukraine a big present in 2014 by making Ukrainian nation much more united than it had been before. Because before, half of the Ukrainian nation were clearly believing that Russians are the same brothers as Ukrainians, and some of them even believe that we are much closer to Russians than to Ukrainians who live at the western part of the country. But after 2014, this narrative stopped, because Putin just showed us who is the friend, who is the enemy, and that we are still Ukrainians, and that there are some things where we are different from Russians. But still, as for using weapons, as I understand, there is a very strong, not very strong rejection, but a very different attitude in the Russian society to the possibility of conflict with Ukraine, because it's not the same situation as with Crimea, which was taken peacefully, unlike the situation when they would have to go to war with Ukrainians. I think that there is no consensus, and there are a lot of ideas that Russian society won't be able to digest this narrative as easily and as happily as it was with the Crimean narrative. As for Ukrainians, I think that the idea of war is still the government is doing everything to show us and to persuade us that there will be no war, and there is no way to panic. And I think that these issues are even not as much discussed Because on the other hand, we are still at war since 2014. That is why the fact that we are fighting with Russians in Donbass is very popular for a long time. This is why, and I think that in the recent speech of Zelensky, there was the idea that there is nothing new, we're already fighting, we're already at war for many years. This is why this issue of, but the issue of direct war, all-out war, is not as much discussed in Ukrainian society now.
Yeah, that's a good point, because President Zelensky just yesterday or day before, and also the Ukrainian foreign minister, both said publicly there is no impending war coming. Whereas you find Boris Johnson and Biden, they are warning that, war is going to happen tomorrow. And both of these leaders in the UK and the US are very unpopular domestically and are facing domestic challenges, and therefore fomenting an external threat is always an issue to improve your domestic standings. Mariana, among the questions, did you want to pick up on any?
Yeah, so I'll pick up on the whole sort of nuclear dimension, right? So both Yuri Krivonos's question on sort of if Russia did not have nuclear weapons, and the Lars's question, helpful question about the sort of mention of deployment. The answer to the question whether there are nuclear weapons or tactical nuclear weapons deployed to Crimea is we don't know, right? We have no way of penetrating or verifying, and we hope not. That would actually be very bad for the international non-proliferation regime, given that it's still de jure Ukrainian territory and it's a non-nuclear weapon state. But there are dual capable systems that are deployed there. There are bombers that are capable of delivering nuclear ordnance that are deployed to Crimea. It is a very militarized, it's a kind of this garrison enclave, just like Kaliningrad is the garrison exclave. So there's no way of knowing of whether that is the case, but it's not accidental that these kind of things are mentioned by President Putin. And we remember in 2014 too, he had mentioned in a different interview that, hey, just remember, you all, Russia is a powerful nuclear state. So when we think about the uses of nuclear weapons, right, we can't just kind of contain that notion to actually launching nuclear weapons, right? These communications are also the uses of nuclear weapons, right? It is, we think a nuclear threat somehow would be publicly issued in a statement saying, all right, now we are going to attack you with nuclear weapons. This is not just the way it happens. It's something that exists implicitly in the international system. And every American decision maker and every European decision maker has that on the back of their mind, that Russia is a nuclear armed country. And as Yuri had pointed out, that notion, that calculation would be different had Russia not been, the biggest nuclear weapon state in the world with the most nuclear weapons. One wonders whether President Obama's reaction to the incursions in the war in the Donbass, his calculus about providing Ukraine with lethal defensive weapons might have been different. Was there not a fear of escalating to a nuclear level?
Thank you. So, Nikolai, there were a couple of questions. I'll repeat this allegation or statement that President Putin might have made that 70 to 200 nuclear weapons could have been used. Also, why Russia didn't insist on written assurances on NATO expansion that Russia believes were given by the US during the Bush senior administration. And I'll relate another question. There is a YouTube clip floating around where President Putin is saying that the Russia has a launch on warning strategy, and if it is confirmed that their incoming missiles will hit targets in Russia, Russia will launch a retaliatory attack. And then he says that, of course, everyone will be killed, Russians will go to heaven, and everyone else will be dead. So I thought whether you might want to comment on that as well. Over to you.
The last question is a whole different presentation.
Okay.
So
right.
I don't remember Putin invoking nuclear weapons vis-a-vis Ukraine. So I would like to see like a footnote for that speech that Lars actually quoted, because I don't remember it. Yes, and I don't actually remember any case where any Russian official was involved nuclear weapons vis-a-vis Ukraine. Yes, and there was simply no need. Now responding to Mariana, well, we can argue ad infinitum whether Ukraine with nuclear weapons would have changed the calculation that Russia had in 2014. I just don't think so. That's all. There are many kind of cases. Well, you see, well, it was clearly a sub-nuclear kind of thing, yes, especially given the situation in Ukraine in 2014. That was really kind of, yeah, I seriously doubt that would have affected things. War between Russia and Ukraine. Just today, actually, there was a statement by the Foreign Ministry of Russia that war between Russians and Ukrainians is unthinkable.
Could you repeat that, Nikolai?
Just today, there was a statement coming from the Foreign Ministry. Yeah, I can actually find it. Yes, it's somewhere on my computer, open there. That it's the official kind of view of Moscow that war between Russians and Ukrainians is unthinkable.
Okay.
So yeah, well, that's kind of this whole situation. Yeah, and really, when we talk about the threat of war today, Ukraine does not actually play a big role there. We talk about potential military conflict between Russia and NATO. Yes, it could actually be triggered by events in Ukraine, but hardly there'll be a large-scale war between Russia and Ukraine. Yes, and if it does, no way it will end there. Well, really, the current crisis about the relationship between Russia and NATO. Yes, and Ukraine features there, but only in terms of Donbass, but that's my understanding. So NATO enlargement and why Gorbachev did not insist on written assurances. Well, just because he negotiated in that way. That's all. It was just an oversight. He did not even ask for a clarification of what exactly Baker actually meant. Because it remained quite unclear whether he just meant what East Germany, or was it the broader statement, and so on and so forth. So he just let it slip. Yeah, great. Yes, everything is good. Yes, I was promised. Yeah. Yes, it was an argument for the Politburo. Oh yes, and not a bilateral kind of deal or something like that. Yeah. So yes, okay. I actually never thought that Gorbachev and Shevardnadze were actually good negotiators. Let's put it like that. Yes, I have reasons actually to say that, because yes, I've seen how it all worked. Yes, question about sanctions against Russia. Yes, I think I said that. Major sanctions like SWIFT, like this, like that, no ban on Russian gas in Europe, you name it. That's all possible, but if it's done now, before anything has really started, then all deals are off. Yes, and there are no limits on what actually Russia can do. Ukraine is just, once again, part of the picture. Yes, it's more about actually NATO. So, well, I think everyone should be very, very careful. We see some very small, really tiny, promising kind of signs of a possible deal. The arms control is in confidence building negotiations with the United States and NATO, and possibly with a solution to Donbass. Yes, if we can achieve that, well, that would be actually a very good idea.
Okay, so we are now pretty much.
Let me actually say literally one more sentence.
Right.
So what I said, we failed to create a stable security architecture. Today, we are witnessing the first attempt ever to change the existing security architecture without going to war first. To do it through negotiations, through crisis, brinksmanship, and stuff like that. So when it comes very close to war, but no one really wants actually war. And it remains to be seen whether we can actually modify the existing international system in a peaceful way, well, in a reasonably peaceful way.
Okay, good.
It's first
sort of It's sort of interesting that the West accuses Russia of using gas as an economic weapon, whereas on the other hand, the West is using all the economic instruments it has as a political weapon, not only against Russia, but I don't know how many countries are under sanctions. So that was an interesting point you made, that we may be witnessing perhaps the beginnings of a discussion on a new security architecture. And there are different views. The Russians put forward these two treaties that they want the Americans and the NATO countries to negotiate and respond to. And then yesterday, NATO and the US provided the responses to what the Russians were demanding. So how does one foresee a way out of the current situation? Because, you know, the two presidents agreed that a nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. But they very conveniently forgot that Reagan and Gorbachev agreed in a bigger package, which was that neither side would fight a conventional or a nuclear war, and neither side would seek military superiority. So this understanding of not fighting and winning a nuclear war, you know, didn't just arrive out of the blue. It was conditioned on two pillars. And it's sort of interesting that even us in our academic community, we have been championing no nuclear war, but we forgot about these two other foundational pillars. And so how do we find a way back to this, that in a nuclear age where we still have 13,000 nuclear weapons, there are 9 countries, that nuclear weapons really are not a solution to providing security. They end up being actually more drivers of insecurity and proliferation. So I'll start with you, Nikolai, and maybe if you can wrap it up in 2 or 3 minutes, and then the same Polina and Mariana, and then I'll hand it back to Peter.
Well, let's put it like that. Once again, the Budapest Memorandum was part of that time when we did hope for a stable, inclusive international system that's based on international regimes and cooperation and things like that. Once that system began to collapse, we also lost the Budapest Memorandum. So that's not just one. So it's not the only thing that collapsed. It was a very broad collapse, and that's part of that broad collapse. Can we go? What can we find a way out of that situation? Well, I hope that we can. But the situation is really very, very tense here. Yeah, I do actually hope that there will be negotiations on arms control, in confidence building measures between the United States and Russia and NATO in Russia. Yes, I hope that there will be a solution to Donbass. At least these two big elements should make the situation somewhat more stable, yes, and then we can address so everything else. But we need to start rebuilding the international system almost from scratch. When you talk about NPT, in the destabilizing impact of nuclear weapons, I would say that many states with nuclear weapons is actually very destabilizing. But I would also say that in the absence of nuclear weapons, we'd be having a conventional World War III right now. So yes, well, really the only reason why we don't have World War III right now is the presence of nuclear weapons. But if 20, 30, 50 states in the world would have nuclear weapons today, there would be a nuclear World War III. So it's a very, very kind of delicate balance. Yes, and I would rather actually try to rebuild political instruments. Yes, when it comes specifically to the best, the Budapest Memorandum, yes, in Ukraine. Yes, I already said what I think about the memorandum, but really, well, I myself never had any psychological kind of problems seeing Ukraine as an independent state that's foreign to Russia, that got like its own interests. I frankly wasn't very happy with Ukrainian diplomats back in '92, but that was primarily because they were mostly young people with no experience. But that's actually quite transitory. So, so yes, I always actually treated understood Ukraine as an independent state. The fact that Russians and Ukrainians are very close at so many levels. Well, so what they can still actually live in different states. Yes, no big deal there.
Okay, good.
So yeah, I hope that that eventually, kind of these things, yes, in the current crisis, will be overcome.
Thank you,
it
Nikolai.
will actually leave its imprint, no question there. But I think things can be stabilized. I hope so.
Okay, very good. Thank you, Polina.
Yes, thank you. Well, I think that, you know, as Ukrainian, I think that I'm permitted now to believe that nuclear war won't happen, not because of the declarations of the great power, but only because of the existence of nuclear deterrence and the work of nuclear deterrence. And so I agree with Nikolai that probably if non-nuclear weapons existed, then really we had a very strong probability of a big conventional war or world conventional war. And again, speaking about the existence, the possibility whether nuclear weapons in Ukraine's head would deter Russia from annexing Crimea and you know, interfering in Donbass, I would probably agree with Nikolai because yes, the existence of nuclear weapons is not saving states from the low-level conventional conflict, and the stability and instability paradox is something about that. But I would believe that if Ukraine had nuclear weapons, the current situation would not happen. I mean, there would not be a global blackmail of Russia threatening to invade Ukraine if Ukraine had nuclear weapons now. I think that it would be some different situation. I mean, Russia would ask for the security guarantees differently. Yes, and again, what is probably important for us to understand in this in the current situation is, there are two approaches to the current conflict. Russia says that the issue is not in Ukraine. That issue is the principle is that they just want security guarantees of NATO non-enlargement and other things. And the West is saying that Russia wants Ukraine so much that they are pretending they want some kind of security guarantees, but in fact they just want, all they want is Ukraine. In my interest is to believe that Russia just wants the principle of non-enlargement, because if Russia really wanted Ukraine, it probably would invade Ukraine much longer before and would not stay and threaten for a long time at the borders of Ukraine. And I think that in this, connected with this, if we comment on the declarations on the statements of the world powers, I think that Russia is very happy about that kind of fuss which is going on around it standing on the borders of Ukraine, because the main thing is to threaten and to frighten the whole world with what Russia can do with Ukraine. But because it's a coercion process, right? The coercion will fail as soon as it invades Ukraine. And this regard, I think that this kind of alarmism plays for Russia, what the world is doing at the moment. Yeah, maybe I will stop here and give the word for Mariana.
Okay, thank you, Mariana. Last words to you.
Yes, thank you. I mean, so much to say and yet so little time. I suppose I'd like to my concluding remarks to be this. I think it's not just an attempt to renegotiate this post-Cold War, post-Soviet settlement. It is what the current situation exposes is really how we think of power and what counts as power and what works as power in this current global world order. I choose to remain a bit more agnostic about just how much we can trust deterrence to keep us safe. Yet what it exposes is that certain old-fashioned coercive methods, that conflating power with just the military power or with just kind of a capacity of one actor to force the other to bid their will, that's bound to backfire, right? It's really not the kind of currency of power that we're talking about anymore. There's a great saying in Russian, "Насильно мил не будешь." You cannot force someone to love you, right? A true essence of power is a ability to generate a following, is an ability to lead by example. Had Russia created the kind of structures of security, of political governance, of economic management that others would love to follow, they would have, right? And to renegotiate that, to make someone do otherwise, it would take force and coercion to maintain that kind of new settlement, a new equilibrium. And the moment, it's like with the Soviet Union, the moment that force and coercion is withdrawn, the whole system will fall apart again. So when we're thinking about kind of renegotiating the status quo, these are the kinds of things we really need to keep in mind. Thank you.
Good, thank you. So that was a very interesting discussion. There are sort of many, many reasons why we ended up here, the current situation, questions whether NATO should have expanded in the first place or not. One of the lessons that came out of the Cuban Missile Crisis was that the two big nuclear superpowers should not share borders. And if NATO begins now to have borders with the Russian Federation, we can see what sort of response is coming from that side, justified or not. And I'm actually quite horrified to sort of conclude on the thing that actually nuclear deterrence works, and because of nuclear weapons, we didn't have a war. It's because Iraq didn't have nuclear weapons that it got clobbered in 2003. Iran still doesn't have nuclear weapons, and it's threatened with all options on the table. North Korea has carried out 6 nuclear tests and many, many missile tests, and nobody threatens it with military action. So it is really sending the wrong message with regard to power, nuclear weapons, and the attributes that nuclear weapons provide. Anyway, this is a very long and involved discussion. So thank you, Nikolai, Mariana, Polina, for a very interesting 2-hour discussion. And with that, I will pass over to Peter. But before that, I'd like to mention that on the 7th of February at 4 o'clock Central European time, Atomic Reporters is holding a webinar on the NPT and what are the recent developments with participation by UN Undersecretary General Izumi Nakamitsu, the High Representative for Disarmament, Ambassador Gustavo Slavadin, the President-designate of the NPT Review Conference whenever it is held, Ambassador Alexander Kement of Austria, who's the President-designate of the first meeting of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. We also have Ambassador Jakob Holgren, who is currently the Disarmament Ambassador of Sweden. And finally, we also have Maria Antonieta Huáquez, who is the Senior Diplomat of Mexico at the Mexican mission to the UN in New York. So that also will be a very interesting discussion. So thank you again, Nikolai, Mariana, and Polina, and over to you, Peter.
A vote of thanks on behalf of our audience, who I can't see and I can't hear, to our speakers, to Polina. It was great working with you, and I hope we can continue this sort of partnership. Mariana, thank you so much. Nikolai, your views are much appreciated. A very quick reminder, we put it in the chat. Follow us on social media. Go to our website. Sign up. We're going to have a series of very interesting briefings in the upcoming year. So please stay in touch. And thank you for being with us today. I hope you found it interesting. Okay, with that, I'm going to say goodbye. See you next time.
Thank you. Bye.